Cuban government, but that in fact is not the case of the Cuban Five, and that is not what they're asking. It's actually an issue of terrorism. I mean, if we think about it, like this, the United States since 2001, since 9/11, I think Mr. Smith pointed out very, very aptly that the Cubans have been extremely open to the anti-terrorist actions, I guess, that have been taking place around the world in terms of, laws and conventions and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, since 2001, the United States has launched a global war on terror, invaded 2 countries, imprisoned thousands of people, killed thousands of people, and yet and still, this is considered legitimate, or at least in the eyes of the body politic in the United States, because the United States is protecting its interest, its individuals, its citizens. 5 Cubans who came to the United States unarmed, committed no crimes, but to do basically the same thing, to protect their friends, their family, the people they live with in their country against terrorism. But in fact, those people have been imprisoned, and imprisoned unjustly for many, many years in very harsh circumstances, often kept for months and months at a time in the hole. And so really this is an issue of terrorism, not an issue of whether you support Castro or you don't support Castro. The issue of the Cuban Five is, does Cuba as a country have the right to defend itself? Does Cuba as a country, or does the United States as a country have the right to allow individuals to plan attacks against Cuba in impunity, allow them to live in the United States, move freely around the United States, organize militarily their actions? That's what's at stake here in the case of the Cuban Five. And there's many issues we can get into. Hopefully, in the question and answer, people will have more to say, and we can really get into the Cuban Five. But yeah, I think really that's all I'll say. I'll just end on the fact that when we look at the case of the Cuban Five, one thing that it's important to remember is they were not here. It wasn't like a cloak and dagger operation. And in fact, there was some information sharing between the Cuban government and the United States government around the issue of these terrorists in Miami and them being arrested in the illegal actions they were committing. But instead of taking any action against any organization planning terrorist actions from the United States against Cuba, past or present, the Cuban Five instead were arrested for gathering information against illegal acts that these people were committing, both against international law and United States law. And that's an important element, I think, of this case. So we'll hear more about the Cuban Five, and I think now we'll hear about the related case of Luis Posada Carriles. I said Jorge Posada. I don't know what I was thinking earlier, baseball. But we'll hear about Luis Posada Carriles from Attorney Jose Portillo. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to go to the podium because I was taught in public speaking to speak on my feet, and I have a tough time thinking sitting down. I was asked to speak about Posada Carriles, but really I looked at this program and it said Cuba, past, present, and future. And that's a whole lot bigger than just Posada Carriles, so I thought I'd branch out a little bit with your indulgence. I came here as a little boy a long, long time ago. I was 9 years old, and my mother at the time was fleeing, not communism, she was fleeing from her mother-in-law in Cuba. She hated her mother. She still hates her mother-in-law, even though the woman's been dead for 25, 30 years. But she saw the revolution as the perfect pretext to escape from Cuba. We landed, as all Cubans, I guess, who come to the United States, in Miami. And we were fortunate enough at the time, while my father was looking for work and my mother worrying that the mother-in-law would soon join us in Miami, we went to a refugee center, and there was a very nice man there who told us about a terrific program that existed back then. A lot of people don't know about it, but it existed. The U.S. government would pay a one-way ticket to any Cuban family who promised to leave Miami as long as they promised not to come back. And when my mother heard that, she saw the map on the table and she said, "Jose Ignacio, what is that city on the extreme left?" Miami's on the right at the bottom. And I said, "Los Angeles." So we not only fled Cuba, we fled Miami. And I grew up kind of in a different way than most Cuban Americans, but I have lived all of my adolescence and adult life with this abnormal relationship between the United States and Cuba. It's something that speaks home to me because I've never known anything else. And I've yearned for a certain sense of normalcy with the country where I was born and with the country where I live. To this day, I also have an abnormal situation in that my wife, my stepdaughter, my family lives in Cuba. I live in a suitcase. And it's hard as hell to go back and forth. But I do it, and I would love nothing better than for the United States and Cuba to mend fences and have a normal relationship. But there are what we call in Spanish, piedras en el camino, obstacles in the way. And there have been obstacles on the way from the beginning. Way, way back, if you have to go to the beginning of the foundation of this country to see really what's permeated U.S.-Cuba relations. And I picked up a couple little quotes here and there from people you may know from your history books. John Quincy Adams: "The annexation of Cuba to our federal republic will be indispensable to the continuance and integrity of the Union itself." He goes on, "There are laws of political as well as of physical gravitation, and if an apple, severed by the tempest from its native tree, cannot choose but fall to the ground, Cuba, forcibly disjoined from its own unnatural connection with Spain, and incapable of self-support, can gravitate only towards the North American Union, which by the same law of nature cannot cast her off from its bosom." Thomas Jefferson: "Cuba is the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states." Robert Campbell, U.S. Consul in Cuba in 1843. "Cubans have an abiding conviction of their utter incapacity for self-government." General Albert Wood, he was the military governor of Cuba from 1900 to 1902. "We are dealing with a race that has steadily been going down for 100 years, into which we," meaning the United States, "have got to infuse new life, new principles, and new methods of doing things." Charles Magoon, not Mr. Magoo, but Mr. Magoon, U.S. Governor General of Cuba: "Cubans are hot-blooded, high-strung, nervous, excitable, and pessimistic. This makes it necessary for the U.S. to take them in hand, control, direct, and manage their government and public policy." I can go on, but I won't. But I'll finish with this one. George W. Bush: "We're not waiting for the day of Cuban freedom, we're working for the day." This is upon the presentation of a report called "Hastening the Cuban Transition Report of the Commission for the Assistance of Free Cuba. 62 steps that the U.S. was taking to trigger a regime change in Havana, even though Cuba doesn't belong to the Union." Jose Marti, our patriot, I guess you all know Jose Marti, I won't tell you who he is. He said, "The scorn of our formidable neighbor who does not know us is our America's, Latin America's, greatest danger." And it is that scornful paternalism that permeates U.S. policy towards Cuba and has done so from the beginning, more so since the Cuban Revolution, because in 1959 that colony became a nation and spoke and sang a different tune. The U.S.